Hello, my name is Olurotimiosha. Today is July the 25th, 2026, and I'm continuing with my discussion of Homer's The Odyssey. I'm talking about the final book in the English translations. It's divided into books, and the final book is book 24. Book 24 packs a few things which Christopher Nolan lives out of. He leaves out of his very successful blockbuster reinterpretation of Homer's The Odyssey. And right now, I'm going to discuss one of the scenes in the final book. There are three important scenes, right, that can be distinguished in the final book. In this video, I'm going to discuss the the transportation of the conveyance of the dead suitors, right? The 108 suitors that had been killed by Odysseus on his return in his house. So they are transported, uh, in the underworld where they meet Achilles and Agamemnon, right? The dead heroes of the Trojan War, and they're telling them how they died and all of that. So that's one part. That's what I'm going to do in this video. Discuss that part. And there's another important scene, right? So Odysseus, the after he'd slaughtered the suitors, he leaves his house with his son and a loyal servant, right? And they go to his father's house, right? So he wants to get help. His father doesn't know he's back. His father doesn't know what happened to him. And so Odysseus meets his father Laertes, right? And it just shows you the circumspection, the self-restraint of Odysseus, right? He hadn't seen his father and he loved his father, right? He hadn't seen his father for 20 years. Somebody else would be, they'd be carried away with emotion. But Odysseus wants to know the mindset of his father. And so he pretends, right? He pretends like he's a stranger. He restrains himself and he gets into a conversation with his father when he sees his father in his house. His father is farming, right? And he's talking with his father, he has his banter with him just to know the mindset of the father. So I'm going to discuss, so that's one segment, right? Until Odysseus eventually reveals who he is, that he's Odysseus is returned. He's not dead because his father thinks he's dead. And then the last scene when they actually get into the fight with the relatives of the suitors, right? And that's all in book 24. So just 12 of them: Odysseus, his father, and his son Telemachus, and then nine loyal servants, right? So 12 of them, they fight the relatives, the cities coming after them, the relatives of the dead suitors, because they're noble people, right? And so that's the final scene until the divine intervention of Zeus and Athena, right? And that's the end. So this is the final book, and Christopher Nolan leaves all of that out. Um, I haven't seen the movie yet, but I've seen excerpts, clips of the movie, and of course reviews, and classicists complaining, and some people complaining about how Nolan has reinterpreted it, and I'm quite amused. I've read the book The Odyssey and I loved it. I've read two different translations. I enjoyed it so much, and the Odyssey again, it's called the greatest story ever told. So it's interesting how the way Christopher Nolan seems to have remade the story entirely. Because I've watched other movies about Odysseus. There's a TV series or a TV version, right, that was done. I've also watched Ulysses, right? So the Latin interpretation of the Odyssey, Odysseus is called Ulysses, right? And so there was one that was done by Kirk Douglas, very good one. I've seen that as well, and those, they're true, like they're true to the story of Homer, right? They're Homeric tales, and told, according to how Homer told the story in the Odyssey. But it looks like Nolan has rewritten something and he's reinterpreted it, like I said, according to presentism and in an anachronistic fashion, right? And of course, he's bashed in this modern times negative view of war, that as war is terrible, war causes PTSD, and we see Odysseus is portrayed as suffering from PTSD. Now, in the final scene, apparently Odysseus self-exiles after the slaughter of the suitors in his home, and it's interpreted mischaracterized as Odysseus self-exiles because he violated Xenia, the law of hospitality, not the other way around. That well, the suitors were the ones who actually violated Xenia, the laws of hospitality. So, but Nolan uh, mis you know reinterprets it that well, Odysseus's slaughter, right? That he owed the treacherous suitors their lives or something. He owed them at least their lives, not to kill them, and he killed them, and he therefore violated Zeus's law of hospitality, and that's why he had to self-exile with Penelope's wife, and they go off to sail on to the sunset and leave Telemachus in charge as the new king of Ithaca. Well, that's not what Homer does in the Odyssey, right? That's not the ending. Odysseus and Odysseus doesn't have PTSD about war. Um, and I thought about it that look, Nolan is an intelligent man. He couldn't have, that is a terrible misinterpretation the of Xenia, the law of hospitality, and Odysseus. His character Odysseus would not be foolish enough to misinterpret Xenia as well, because Odysseus is supposed to be the cleverest, of the kings. He's very clever. That's what he's known for. And then I thought about it that, well, possibly consistent with Nolan's retelling, his remake, right, of the story with that PTSD theme, then I guess Odysseus's misinterpretation in his film, in Nolan's version, of his violation of Zeus's law of hospitality in his slaughter of the treacherous suitors in his home, who had eaten him out of house and home. Um, that that was an aspect of Odysseus's PTSD. He had become delusional, and he had this false belief that, because he was constantly remorseful. That's something someone with PTSD would undergo. So it looks like Nolan is continuing his theme, right, of his narrative of the PTSD and infusing it and making Odysseus's typical intelligent way of thinking disorganized and irrational, right? So he's now delusional and misinterpreting, what Xenia was. But in any event, I'm going to continue that discussion, that analysis in another video. Right now, I want to talk about what happened when the dead suitors met Achilles and Agamemnon and the other heroes of the Trojan War, who were, in the underworld. The underworld was the place the dead went to in Greek mythology. So the the god who conveyed them into the underworld was Hermes, right? Hermes was the god of, he was the god who transported, who guided the dead into the underworld, right? He was also the, messenger from Zeus to the gods to mankind. He was also the god of travelers, right? So, and this is, and he was a god of thieves and tricksters, right? So we see Hermes in earlier scenes. Hermes had helped Odysseus. For instance, when he met Circe, it was Hermes who gave Odysseus the antidote to her magic potion and gave a Mali, and he was one who advised Odysseus that, well, if he makes love to Circe when she invites him to her bed, that's the only way he can free his men whom she'd converted to swine. So that's Hermes, and Hermes was the one who conveyed Zeus's order to Calypso to release Odysseus, right, from his 7-year captivity and let him go back to his family. So uh, so in the underworld, the suitors, they see, were introduced in the 24th book, the final chapter, right, the final book of the Odyssey, Homer's The Odyssey. It starts with, you know, Achilles, Agamemnon, they're in the underworld, they're dead. And Achilles and Agamemnon are rhapsodizing each other, right? This is something that the Greeks did back then. In fact, at one time, and it's, it can be corny. At one time, Agamemnon was actually said Achilles was the most handsome of all the Greeks, right? He was the most handsome man of all the Greeks, So and it was something the Greeks did back then, right? In the classics, you see a lot of that. They do it in a poetic way, and Achilles in turn rhapsodizes Agamemnon because Agamemnon was the most powerful king. He was the chief of all the Greek armies, right? And so Achilles said, well, that he always thought, everybody always believed that Agamemnon was the most favored Greek, was the most favored person in Zeus's heart, right? That Zeus favored Agamemnon the most. So, there they were rhapsodizing one another. And eventually they see, they see the suitors being conveyed in as they arrive. And they recognize the suitors, especially one of them called Amphimedon. Amphimedon was the son of a nobleman of Ithaca named Melanius, right? Melanius, and not Menelaus, Melanius. The names, you have to keep track of the names. So when Agamemnon sees him, and Achilles, they ask him, what are they doing here? Because they were very young. They were young men, and they were stunned. Why so many of them from Ithaca? Why were they here? They're young. What happened? And so Amphimedon then, by the way, something interesting happens, and so you see the part about how when Agamemnon and his brother Menelaus, who was the husband of Helen of Troy, when they were recruiting men to go and fight the Trojan War, they specifically went to Ithaca and tried to persuade Odysseus. And here in the underworld, Agamemnon is saying it how it was very difficult, that they had to stay for a whole month because Odysseus didn't want to come, right? They tried to get Odysseus to come along. Odysseus was reluctant. He didn't want to come along. So you see that that bit of narrative, right? That perspective in this final book. So Amphimedon then explains. So that's when Agamemnon says that when they tried, because they stayed for a month trying to persuade Odysseus to come along and join them for the Trojan War, that's how they met Amphimedon and his father, and so they knew him well. And Amphimedon said, of course, he remembered, and Amphimedon explained what happened. So it's kind of interesting that Amphimedon, they expose their own treachery, right? They don't blame Odysseus, even though they say he used cunning and all that stuff. And they talk about how he came disguised as an old beggar in his own house, and they admitted that they abused him, hurled insults, and even assaulted him, thinking he was an old beggar in his own house, and he didn't respond. He was restrained, and they didn't know. And they said, well, at some point, but the thing is, they pointed out the treachery of Penelope, right? They accused her of being treacherous. They didn't blame Odysseus, interestingly, but they were blaming Penelope for being cunning, that she deceived them instead of telling them point blank that, and that was the word that was used in this version, right? This translation. And instead of telling them point blank that she wasn't going to marry marry them, that her heart was still waiting for Odysseus, right? So they basically insulted her. They disparaged her, that she was deceiving them, pretending to be weaving cloth for her father-in-law. That's Odysseus's father, for his impending death. And so that she would, that she was deceiving them, because of course every night she would undo the weaving that she'd done all day long. And so and she's, they claimed, Agamemnon was claiming that, well, that her plan was to destroy them, that it was something that she'd conspired with Odysseus all along to destroy them, and she was just waiting for Odysseus to come. And that when Odysseus came, that it was she, and Odysseus, and Telemachus, they had planned to hide all their weapons. And when they weren't paying attention, they took all their weapons and went to hide them so that they wouldn't have weapons to fight back when Odysseus attacked them. And they locked them, they barricaded them inside. And how she planned to, make them all string Odysseus's bow, and they couldn't. And he narrated everything about how the beggar wanted to Odysseus. They didn't know it was Odysseus. He was trying to string the bow himself, and they wouldn't. They tried, but she insisted that they allow him, and eventually did. And that she talked about how Penelope had actually planned the number of arrows, the exact number of arrows that were necessary, and iron and swords that were necessary to slaughter them all, and that she'd kept them and planned it all. They just made it seem like she was this evil genius that had planned their own destruction. And so Odysseus, of course, killed them, and they talked about how Antinous was the first to be killed by Odysseus, and they were all slaughtered, and so it was, they didn't really lay the blame on Odysseus' feet. It was funny the way they describe it, right? And so they're like, now look, even their bodies, because these are ghosts, right? It's their ghost in the underworld, right? There's a translation, it calls it Hades, right? So it's clear the Greeks didn't think of the afterlife as a heaven and a hell, right? So it's just where everybody goes to, right? The dead go to, and that's it, right? Their ghost is there. So they were saying that, well, that even as they were speaking, Odysseus had, their dead bodies were still laying in their blood, excuse the graphic expression, in Odysseus's house, and they hadn't been given a burial, and their families, weren't able to give them a fitting burial, so that was their lament. And Agamemnon now speaks. Agamemnon is so impressed, he starts to praise Penelope, that the immortal gods, the gods are going to create a song for Penelope, for her consistency, for her constancy, her love, her loyalty towards her husband, and about how intelligent she was. She's a woman of virtue, so intelligent, so loyal to her husband, that her name is going to go down in history for all times, that men would want a woman like her. So he praises Penelope, right? And then he draws the contrast with his wife, right? Clytemnestra, very difficult to pronounce that name. Clytemnestra, by the way, is the sister of Helen of Troy, right? So Clytemnestra is the wife of Agamemnon, right? And she plotted to have him killed, right? So when he returned, it's not in the Odyssey or in the Iliad, but it is said in the Greek mythology, it is said that Agamemnon has sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia so they could have success in the Trojan War, and so Clytemnestra never forgave him, and she took on a lover. Her lover was Aegisthus, who was an overthrown king, who was actually the relative of Agamemnon, right? So it was like a family feud to seize the throne. And so I think Aegisthus was Agamemnon's cousin or something like that. So, and he became the love of Clytemnestra, and when he returned, she treacherously had him killed. So he was lamenting that. And you see Achilles, Achilles also lamented that, about how the great Agamemnon died in such a disgraceful manner by his wife and her lover in his own house, that it would have been better if he had died, a glorious, honorable hero's death on the battlefield of Troy. That, how come he won the campaign only to be treacherously killed by his wife and her lover in his own home. There's a version that he was killed in his bathtub. I can't remember in the Odyssey. I can't remember if that's the version that Homer tells in the Odyssey. But so Agamemnon praises Penelope, and in contrast, he disparages. He condemns his wife as treacherous, as Clytemnestra, as she's treacherous, and so you see that scene in the Underworld. That's the Suitors recounting what happened to them, and with Achilles and Agamemnon, they're rhapsodizing one another. Now I'll continue with the final battle scenes and the interaction between Odysseus and his father. My name's Olurotimi Osha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.